Ettore. Good morning, everyone. Please let me first reiterate and stress how happy and grateful I am that the IAI and the VCDMP decided to embark in this journey together. Well, welcome everyone to the first session of today's meeting, the impact of COVID-19 and other biosecurity challenges. My name is Federica Dall'Arche. I'm a non-proliferation and disarmament researcher at the Istituto Affari Internazionali. I am extremely happy and excited to chair this session today. First of all, because the topic is extremely timely and a lot of the early assumptions on the virus have been challenged recently, including the origins of the virus. But secondly, because the person who will address the topic today is one of the greatest experts in the field, Filippa Lentzos. She's a prolific writer, often on the news channels. And funny story, actually, a couple of weeks ago, I turned on my TV on a Sunday night, and there she was on an Italian TV show. So I'm sure it's very difficult for you not to know her. But in case you're not familiar with her career, Dr. Filippa Lentzos is a senior lecturer in science and international security at the Department of War Studies at King's College London. She's also an associate senior researcher at the CIPRI, a biosecurity columnist at the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and the NGO coordinator for the Biological Weapons Convention. Filippa's research and teaching focuses on biological threats and on how to guard against them. She has published widely on issues related to transparency, confidence building, and compliance assessment of biosecurity and biodefense programs, among other things. So without further ado, I know everybody is very anxious to hear from her. So Filippa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Federica, for that very warm introduction. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic. It's a great pleasure to be here with all of you. I'm excited to talk about this topic, which is or has become very dear to my heart and that I've talked a lot about over the last year or so. So we're going to talk a little bit about, obviously, as the title says, the impact of the pandemic and other biosecurity challenges. So 2020 was a year like no other. The pandemic changed the world in a way that very few had anticipated. So what I'm going to do in my presentation today is really to make or to do four things. I will outline a very brief timeline of the pandemic, highlighting things that are of particular interest to my presentation today. And then I will recognize the impacts on people's health and on society more widely. Third, I will highlight competing theories on the origins of SARS-CoV-2. And finally, I will spend the majority of my time considering the implications for the global biosecurity architecture. So there's a fair bit to cover there today, and I won't spend much more on the preliminaries. I'll just dive straight in. So in terms of milestones of the pandemic, you're all familiar with this story, but it is interesting to kind of run through it like this on a timeline and kind of relive where you were at those times, because you will, of course, recognize so much of what is on here. So on the very last day of 2019, the WHO picked up media reports about cases of viral pneumonia in Wuhan. On the 1st of January 2020, the WHO requested information from the Chinese authorities, which it then received on the 3rd of January. On the 5th of January, the WHO issued a web-based disease outbreak news report, sort of alerting, this is standard practice, alerting news outlets and other global health partners to the fact that there were these there seemed to be some cases of viral pneumonia. On the 9th of January, the WHO reported that the Chinese authorities had determined the outbreak was caused by a novel coronavirus. And 2 days later, the WHO received the genetic sequences of the new virus from the Chinese authorities. Very interesting story behind all of that, of how that genetic sequence came out. You can read all about it in different papers. But I won't dwell on it here. I'm just flagging it for you to follow up on after. 11th of January, the first death from the novel coronavirus was reported by Chinese media. The 13th, the first recorded case of a lab confirmed coronavirus outside of China was reported in Thailand. And on the 19th of January, the WHO said there was some evidence of limited human-to-human transmission. It almost seems bizarre to look back at that now, that at the beginning there was not, it wasn't recognized that it was human-to-human transmission. On the 30th of January, the WHO finally declares the novel coronavirus outbreak a public health emergency of international concern. That's one of those big terms that's used by the World Health Association, World Health Organization that most people didn't know of before, but sure do now, right? And at that time, there were 98 recorded cases in 18 countries outside of China, but there were no recorded deaths. So we had a public health emergency of international concern without any deaths outside a single, outside China, essentially. On the 11th of February, the WHO names the disease as coronavirus disease 2019, and the virus was named SARS-CoV-2. On the 15th of February, the WHO declared, we're not just fighting an epidemic, we're fighting an infodemic. 7th of March, the number of confirmed COVID-19 cases surpassed 100,000 globally. 8th of March, Italy was the first country to go into or to put all its 60 million citizens on lockdown. Obviously, many more countries followed suit. We all know that. In April 2020, more than half of the world's population resided in countries enforcing a lockdown, which, as we know, resulted in hugely disruptive impacts on individuals and businesses and entire sectors of society. 11th of March, the WHO characterized the outbreak as a pandemic. By that time, Europe was the epicenter of the pandemic. And by the 4th of April, over 1 million cases of COVID-19 had been confirmed worldwide, more than a 10-fold increase in less than a month. By the 7th of April, the WHO convened an ad hoc technical consultation on managing the COVID infodemic, and there were then later further conferences and further consultations on the infodemic, and I'll come back to the point about infodemics later on. In May was the World Health Assembly, the first time it was ever convened virtually, and among other actions, there was a resolution that requested the WHO, together with other organizations and countries, to identify the source of the virus and how it was introduced into the human population. By the end of June, there were over 500,000 deaths reported to the WHO globally. And by the end of September, we were at over 1 million deaths. And by the end of the year, we were looking at 1.8 million deaths globally. And what I think is interesting, also not just to remind ourselves of this pandemic, but also this is the sort of exercises that used to be done when you're preparing for pandemics. So you'd be given tabletop exercises, and this is like the perfect script for one of those. You see how quickly things are moving along. Obviously, this few anticipated anything quite like this. Of course, the impact of COVID-19 goes beyond its high fatality rates. Many of the survivors, for instance, have continued to suffer significant health consequences. These lasting effects, referred to as long COVID, are so far very poorly understood. And the global socio-economic impacts of the pandemic were at levels that have been unprecedented since the Second World War. So the world economic output was at least 7% lower than it would have otherwise been, which doesn't seem like a very big number, except that that was the biggest slump since the 1940s. There were at least 225 million full-time jobs that have disappeared worldwide because of the pandemic. Losses not only significantly worse than those of the global financial crisis in 2009, but also worse than those of the Great Depression of the 1930s. The pandemic also exposed and exacerbated long-standing economic, racial, and gender divides. Many of these socioeconomic effects are highly likely to generate further health effects beyond the direct impacts of COVID-19. And women were in particularly hard hit. Globally, women were overrepresented in the low-paid, precarious professions that were the first and the worst affected by the pandemic. So, in addition to that, women make up roughly 70% of the global health and social care workforce, putting them directly in harm's way and at greater risk from COVID-19. The UN Security Council acknowledged the critical role that women are playing in COVID-19 response efforts, as well as the disproportionate negative impacts of the pandemic, notably the socioeconomic impact on women and girls and others during one of its meetings. And UN Women reported that since the outbreak of COVID-19, all types of violence against women and girls, particularly domestic violence, has intensified, labeling it the shadow pandemics. So a lot of very significant, both social and economic impacts from the pandemic. One of the critical questions of the pandemic is where the novel coronavirus came from. So identifying the source of SARS-CoV-2 is essential for ensuring it's not reintroduced to the human population, and also for reducing the risk of other new virus introductions in the future. But what should have been a routine science question has instead become extremely politically charged. So what do we know about the origins? Well, in fact, we know surprisingly little about how, where, and when SARS-CoV-2 started circulating in Wuhan. And this is one of my earlier, sorry, I was a little slow changing my slides there. This is one of my very early writings identifying this as one of the central questions of the pandemic as we were just a few months into it. So what do we know? Well, we had this just last week, we had the more than 300-page report from the joint WHO-China study into the origins of the pandemic. I want to highlight that this was not an investigation. It was a joint study with China. So any results that come out of that study obviously needs to be seen in that sort of light. There were significant concerns raised about the mandate of the study, about the independence of the study, about access to people, to places, to records for the experts taking part in that study. And there were also significant concerns about delays and the slow timeline in getting to the point of getting on the ground in China and looking at all this. So with all those kind of caveats, What did the report say? Well, the report is actually very light on primary data. It mostly presented reviews of studies that had been conducted by Chinese experts, but that hadn't been published, they hadn't been reviewed by, hadn't been shared, and they hadn't been reviewed by international experts. What the study did was to consider 4 different theories. One, that the virus jumped from an animal directly to a human. The second, that the virus jumped from an animal, this is likely a bat, to an intermediate host and then to a human. The third, that the virus somehow got onto frozen food and was spread that way. And the third, that there was some kind of research-related accident, short term for short, a lab leak theory, but it encompasses more than simply something seeping out of a building. It could also be fieldwork, sampling bats for viruses in caves, or something in the transportation from field site to the lab, or just general infections in the lab. So, but all those are kind of encompassed within the term lab leak. But I prefer research-related safety lapses as a way to better describe what that theory means. The team concluded it seems extremely likely, very likely, that the virus jumped from something like a bat into a host organism and then into humans. It called the lab leak theory extremely unlikely. But if you analyze the report, you see that in drawing those conclusions, the study used different evidentiary standards for these origin theories. So it provided no solid justification for why a lab-related accident should be considered extremely unlikely. And it provided no solid justification for why a natural spillover via an animal host should be considered very likely. Because even though the Chinese studies had sampled 80,000 animals looking for this host animal, they hadn't found anything. So that certainly didn't provide any evidence for that theory. At this stage, there's still no direct evidence for either pathway. There's no verified data or evidence sufficient to rule out any one of the two theories. And at the present time, both precedent and historical evidence amply support both of the theories. So we are, as I said at the very beginning, very much still at this point of not knowing. I've been very vocal in the lab leak versus natural spillover debate. I've written many articles. I've been all over the media, and not just the Anglo-American media and the South China Morning Post, in China, or rather in Hong Kong, but all over Europe in all different languages, Swedish, Danish, media outlets in French, Italian, as Federica was saying, in German, Swiss, Bosnian, Slovenian. It's been fun to watch myself speak, being translated in these different languages on TV, etc., even in Ukraine. So it's really been quite a storm. And I'm very happy to talk more about all of that in the Q&A. With other collaborators, I've also written open letters. The first of these was published jointly at the same time in the Wall Street Journal and Le Monde in France. The second was published just a week or so ago in the New York Times, which was one of the last American significant newspapers to kind of be against the lab leak theory. So it was quite a win for us to get it published in there. The key points of our, so I'm just checking the time. I know I can just kind of ramble on for a bit, and I want to make sure I get all this covered. So very briefly, the key points of our open letters were that there's been a lack of transparency on formulating the joint studies terms of reference. and on the selection of team members. Of course, these are key aspects of any kind of study, and certainly of an investigation, though this isn't a proper investigation. But you know, the terms of reference say what they can and cannot do and what they should focus on, and the team members depend on have their own independence, their own specialisms, etc. So absolute key aspects. There are significant concerns around that. Lots of concern about undue political influence on both of those aspects, on the terms of reference and on the agenda and the organization of site visits, on the skill set that was incorporated for the mission team, as well as the conflicts of interest of a number of the team members. Some of them self-nominated. They weren't just nominated by their countries. You could self-nominate to be on here. And in addition, obviously time is critical. And so the joint study was plagued by delays, from agreeing on the terms of reference to selecting the team members and getting the international team on the ground in China, to then delivering the final report. You might remember it's been delayed and delayed and delayed since that early February news conference from Wuhan. Right. Please do ask me about this in the Q&A. If you want to hear more, I could talk forever. But I should get on to the last point I wanted to make, or the last topic I wanted to focus on, which is really the implications of the pandemic for the global biosecurity architecture. So the pandemic highlighted a problem that's been faced, or that is faced by all governments really, and that is, how do you successfully predict and prepare for biosecurity related threats to citizens and to national and international security? But while the pandemic has highlighted threats from natural and emerging diseases, threats from accidental and deliberate biological outbreaks must not go underestimated. So let me tell you a little bit about these other threats, since we already know everything that there is to know about natural pandemics from our collective COVID experience. So accidental threats. Globally, there are now over 50 maximum biocontainment facilities. These are the BSL-4 labs, if you're biosafety level 4 labs, if you're familiar with that sort of terminology. And these labs are spread throughout Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas. The facilities, these are the facilities that handle some of the most dangerous pathogens. They often carry out genetic manipulations of these pathogens, and some of the pathogens will have pandemic potential. So they hold our riskiest pathogens, and they also do experimental high-risk work with these pathogens. Additionally, now as a consequence of COVID-19, we have now many more researchers who are working with coronaviruses, including researchers who may not have previously worked with these viruses and who therefore have less biosafety experience of working of coronavirus work. And the increasing potential for accidental biological threats underscore the need to make global biosecurity architecture more fit for purpose. I've currently got a project to map all of these labs worldwide, because somewhat shockingly, there is no international organization that has a mandate to have oversight of these labs, to make a list of which labs there are, or to oversight and regulate these labs. So we have no international regulations that they all need to adhere to or any of that. So I'm working with a colleague at Greg Koblenz at the George Mason University in the United States on mapping all of these, and we'll be presenting our publicly available, accessible and user-friendly interface or map where you can learn about where these labs are, and you learn a little bit about them. We'll be launching that at the World Health Assembly meeting in May. So watch this space for more on these labs and the safety concerns around them. Now, deliberate biological threats are also of increasing concern. And, should the intent be there, advances in science and technology, and especially in genomic technologies, are now making it significantly easier to enhance pathogens to make them more deadly, or to modify low-risk pathogens to make them into high-risk pathogens. You could even entirely engineer new pathogens, or recreate extinct ones, such as the variola virus that caused smallpox and is the only real success story we've had in public health of eradicating an entire disease. So these possibilities, these technical possibilities, are coming at a time when new delivery mechanisms for transporting pathogens into human bodies are also undergoing rapid development. So in addition to the traditional bombs and missiles and cluster bombs and sprayers and in different kinds of injection devices that we saw in traditional biological warfare programs, it's now also technically possible to use things like drones, nanorobots, and even insects to deliver pathogens into human bodies. And as genomic technologies develop and converge with artificial intelligence, with machine learning, with automation, with robotics, an ever more refined record of human biometrics, of human emotions, of human behavior will be captured and analyzed. So governments and increasingly private companies will be able to use biological data far more precisely than they ever have before, creating unprecedented possibilities for social and biological control. And I think that's something that, for me, is my worst nightmare. This is one of the aspects that's really, really frightening when you're combining biological data with these tools of manipulation and surveillance. Adding computing power to bioinformatics could not only be used to speed up the identification of harmful genes or DNA sequences, but they could also open up the possibility of ultra-targeted biological warfare. So what we mean by ultra-targeted is you could look at targeting specific individuals or specific groups of individuals. Now, these kinds of developments highlight the need to ensure that countries comply and live up to their obligations under the Biological Weapons Convention. They highlight the need for a strengthened UN mechanism to conduct independent, in-depth investigations of suspected biological weapons use, and the need for a framework to coordinate an international response following any confirmed use of biological weapons. A biological threat, this is really my final point that I'm coming to here, a biological threat that is becoming ever more apparent and which has significantly increased during the rapidly evolving pandemic is biological information warfare. So a hallmark of the pandemic, as we saw in my initial timeline, is what the WHO called the infodemic. That infodemic has made it difficult to separate truthful and trustworthy sources of information from false or misleading ones. And while misinformation and outbreaks have long coexisted, this phenomenon has been disproportionately amplified in the last decade by a combination of social media, the normalization of fake news, and the delegitimization of scientific expertise. So the infodemic likely influenced the course and the severity of the pandemic. It did that by amplifying mistrust of official reporting and rejection of scientific evidence by parts of the general public. So the point here is that when you turn that into the real world, has had real health consequences. So we've seen people not seeking treatment. We've seen people stigmatized of those people that have been infected, that have been stigmatized. We've seen violence against government response facilities, vaccination facilities, violence against healthcare personnel. And we've seen exacerbation of existing political sentiments and movements, such as those opposed to, foreigners or immigrants and those sorts of things. So some experts are now arguing that the consequential nature, because they've had these real health consequences of these disinformation and misinformation campaigns, means that they should be considered as a form of biological threat. So by using disinformation campaigns, some states, and it's clear there are a number of states who have been doing this during the pandemic, they have produced the consequences of biological terrorism warfare without deploying a traditional biological agent and without the technical and regulatory ramifications of their use. So what we're seeing with biological information warfare is an aim to undermine sociopolitical and economic systems by weaponizing or virtually escalating natural outbreaks, rather than directly, making people sick. They're not directly making people sick through your social media, but the behavior that follows what you've been reading on social media is the target, and that is the point here. And so these kinds of battles of influence are likely to escalate in the future. A biological information warfare capability that could replicate the effects of a biological agent while remaining outside of existing normative framework poses significant challenges to disarmament efforts, is what these experts who are putting forward this view say, and I would agree with that. What we're seeing is, the biological threat spectrum evolving, and this now includes natural disease outbreaks, as with COVID. It includes unintended consequences of lab accidents. It includes the intentional use of disease as a weapon, and now arguably, as I've been explaining, also biological information warfare. At this point in time, COVID is far from over, and its impacts will likely be both deep and wide for years to come, including in international security policy. And so new and emerging voices like yours will be important contributions to that debate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Filippa. This was extremely interesting as well as concerning, I must say. I'm a bit speechless, and usually it's very unusual because I usually talk too much. So, but thank you so much for going over all of this information. I would like now to open the floor for questions. You have the choice to either raise your hand and ask the questions in person if you would like to, or just write them in the chat room and I'll be happy to read them for you. But let me see. Okay, I don't see any raised hand at the moment. Okay, so Svenja Vinke.
Yeah, so hello, thank you first of all for the talk, it was really interesting. I was asking myself, what kind of response would you envision if we actually get the proof for one of these theories? So for example, the lab leak theory, because I think all of these theories are kind of valid and we need countermeasures for all of them. So what would happen if we can actually prove one?
Yeah, it's a terrific question. Does it really matter? We're still having to deal with what we're dealing with, right? Well, yes, is the answer. It really does matter because, first of all, it will depend on how we prepare for future pandemics, right? If it was a pandemic that was caused naturally from spillover, from human encroachment on wilderness, we will say we need to invest more in programs to to examine and study this interaction between humans and animals. We might want to try to leave the wilderness more. We might want to give more money to these virus hunters that actively go and seek out viruses. If, on the other hand, it's a lab leak, we might want to say, you know what? Actively hunting for viruses isn't such a good idea. Or we might want to provide more oversight or more regulation around the sorts of work that's being done in these sorts of laboratories. So I think it's important I think that the different theories that were, whichever theory it seems to be, will depend on our actions in the future. So it will depend on where we put our resources in the future. And that's why it's important to figure out how it started.
Many thanks, Filippa. But you're definitely right. Besides attribution of responsibilities, it's important to learn what happened to prevent future pandemics. Before I go to the next person, I would kindly advise and ask everyone to please close your microphone if you're not speaking, that to avoid echo. The second person that I see is Antonina Maria Potzna.
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, thank you. It was very interesting. And I was wondering, I am a jurist, and I was wondering about the legal side of the matter. And I was wondering, how is it possible that all this the experimental part about viruses in the labs, how it is possible that it is not internationally regulated? And I was wondering, what kind of legal future do you see in this matter? Is COVID going to have a huge impact on regulation in this sense? Thank you.
Again, terrific question. And yeah, I too, I'm just astounded that we cannot be regulating such high-risk experiments at a national level. And it sort of also speaks to that first question that Svenja raised. Well, what does it matter? Yeah, depending on how the pandemic originated, we could go really two different ways. But I think in actual fact, we should go both ways. We should stop encroaching on wilderness. We should regulate labs more, right? And so why hasn't this happened before internationally? Well, it is left to individual countries to regulate the sort of science that's being done in their individual countries, and so within their jurisdictions. And so some countries are better at this than others. Some are more advanced. You will always have scientists fighting back against regulations. Labs are already quite heavily regulated. There's been huge debates already in the United States. That's where some is often at the forefront of biological science. And that's also where a lot of these regulatory debates have been playing out. So we saw, for instance, these sorts of gain of function experiments where you deliberately try to mutate viruses to see if they can, for example, become more dangerous, gain certain functions. They were put on a pause. There was a moratorium introduced because there was a backlash against some of that research in 2011, 2012. And so this is again a repeat of similar kinds of worries about this kind of research. What sort of legal future do I see? Well, certainly with the project that I'm currently doing to map these facilities worldwide. I mean, we don't even have an official list of all these maximum containment facilities that we have in the world. That's one of the things I'm trying to address, but it's not as easy as it sounds. It's not like you just go out and count them. You got to find them, and then you have to assess, well, are they BSL-4 or are they BSL-3? Are they BSL-3 plus? What's an agricultural facility? Is that even more or is that less? How do we characterize all this? So it's difficult to get the right sense of actually how many entities do we have, let alone the sort of research that they're doing with these within these entities. But one of the things I certainly will be recommending is that we establish some sort of international oversight body that has a mandate to regulate and provide oversight of these kinds of facilities and the research that they're doing. Now, just a quick caveat, you know, ironically, these labs tend to be fairly well regulated already. The ones that are even less regulated are the BSL-3 labs. And there are so many of those, we don't have numbers. We don't even know, not even in the United States do we know exactly how many there are. At least 1,500, but there could be many more. So globally, we have no idea how many BSL-3 labs there are. And here the regulations are much more, I mean, they're still strict, but they're more relaxed than at the other higher level. And you can do pretty dangerous experiments at BSL-3 level. And so just spotlighting this kind of high risk research, I think, is important to raise awareness about it. But yeah, thanks for the question. I think legal aspects are really important here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Filippa. I have a question in the chat box from a participant. You have briefly mentioned about frozen food as a theory. Could you please elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. So this was a little bit astounding coming out of this joint WHO-China study, that one of the theories they were seriously considering was frozen food as the means by which the new virus had spread into the human population. So the idea, and it's a theory that's been pushed by the Chinese government, right? Because they want to be able to say, didn't originate in China, came from outside. So what they're saying is, obviously it must have some sort of natural occurrence, right? So naturally it would have jumped onto frozen food, but from frozen food, it then say, came into China on frozen fish or packaged food, and from there into the Wuhan market, for instance, and then spread as people were buying this frozen food. Now, every international expert who talks about this says, well, there's absolutely no evidence for this, absolutely none whatsoever. But it fits with Beijing's narrative. And that's one of the reasons why it's been included in the study, included in the report, and it was even labeled as more likely than a lab leak. So I think that just kind of exemplifies the extent to which this whole origin question has been politicized.
Thanks, Filippa. The second person that I see is Virginia Bertuzzi.
Hello. So I think my questions, but I just would like to ask two questions. So whether it was a lab leak or not, even before the pandemic, there were concerns that safety standards at BSL-4 labs were not universally observed. So should we consider labs, especially BSL-4, as nuclear reactors? And is there a necessity to have more trainings on of biosafety? And my second question is how BWC can be implemented for these new sort of biological threats, because in my opinion, it's such a null convention that it's not really, I don't know, it does not catch up with all these new problematic, in my opinion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Virginia. Great question. Yes, there are concerns about safety standards not being universally observed. There are concerns about which standards we should be observing. There is good guidance from the WHO, but nobody has to implement that guidance. You can also implement your own guidance. For instance, what was particularly interesting in the pandemic framework in the case of the Wuhan lab, and in terms of China traditionally has not had a lot of these maximum containment facilities. In fact, Wuhan was its first maximum containment facility, built on blueprints supplied by the French and aided by the French. They were having a lot of, they were getting some support with their biosafety training, but there had been significant issues raised already in various reports in the media, in the expert literature, and also through those State Department cables that you might remember that came out in sort of April last year. So where some American experts had gone into the lab and written back to the US State Department saying, we've got concerns about the level of training of these people and the sorts of work that they're doing, and we're worried some kind of pandemic might even result from this. You know, like you read it and you think that's pretty crazy language in advance of the pandemic that then ensued. But yes, there are significant issues about biosafety, not just the standards, but how it's implemented. And a lot of it should not be implemented just as checkbox exercises, right? It needs to be a culture of responsible science, a culture of safety. And I think that's where the BWC can come in. I share your frustrations about the BWC as a Cold War treaty that's not really adapted to today's context. There is a lot of stagnation within the BWC. It doesn't really feel like it's moving forward. But there are, there are also good things about the BWC. It's one treaty that completely prohibits the misuse of biology that all states, pretty much all states, have agreed to. So in that sense, it sends a very clear message. Its norm is still very strong. Its implementation is patchy. And for sure, that's where a lot of the work now needs to be done. And I think it needs to be framed, and some do frame it like this, as the implementation of biorisk management systems. And within biorisk management, you incorporate deliberate misuse, accidental and natural outbreaks. And so it is also the development of these safety systems. So I hope that's kind of spoken to some of the points that you were making, Regina. But absolutely, all important points. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Filippa. We have so many questions and so little time. We have about 12 minutes left. So I would, it might be better to perhaps ask 3 questions at a time. So, and then we can address them. So I would give the floor to Shruti, after her Nikita, and then Marina, and then back to you, Filippa.
Good morning or good evening, everyone. Hello, Dr. Lentzos. It's very nice to meet you. So similar to what's already been discussed today, biological verification mechanisms are a really important part of international biodefense diplomacy and response, especially with the rise in dual-use biotech research. So how can the international community balance a need for biological verification and oversight with respecting national sovereignty?
Thank you, Shruti. Nikita, please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I have a question about China. So why was it not willing to provide conditions for full investigation? Is it just because it's, in general, really not transparent and closed country? Or they have can have specific reasons for not allowing the investigation, like not willing to show their failures, something like this?
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for the presentation. It was really, really interesting. I was wondering, it has been discussed in the scientific field and also different NGOs, activists, the role of the damaging of natural barriers in general in pandemics and also in COVID. So I was wondering if that has been discussed in the forums in the World Health Organization and in the joint research programs. Thank you.
Can I, Marina, can I just ask you back? I don't think I fully understood your question. You were talking about damaging natural barriers. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. So, like I have read several articles and especially from the scientific field of scientists warning that the climate change and the damaging of the earth resources, which act as natural barriers between pathogens and humans, can be really relevant in preventing future pandemics and future pandemics of this kind. And so I was wondering if this is something which is also being discussed in these research programs, or is this just something that's using several articles and that's that?
Okay, yeah, no, I've not actually heard much discussion about that in this debate at all. And I guess it would be an interesting facet of also the climate change and this encroachment on wilderness. It would speak to that sort of argument as well. But it's not something I've specifically heard in relation to the the current pandemic and the discussion around there. But interesting question. So thank you for that. Shruti, bioverification is very important. It sure is, and we sure don't have any in the Biological Weapons Convention, right? So there is no verification mechanism. Actually, and one of your predecessors asked the question about, do we need an IAEA for the BWC? Well, it would be good, but it's not going to happen. And that is precisely because of what you identified, the difficulty between balancing international oversight and national sovereignty. So there was historically this big discussion in the BWC, not just discussion, there was a big effort, a big attempt to get what was called a verification protocol together. It took about 10 years of intense discussions and negotiations between experts to draft this protocol. And in the end, it was shut down precisely because it was thought that it would be too damaging to national sovereignty. So, and that is something we keep hearing again and again, which makes it very unlikely that there will be, this legal verification regime implemented under the BWC. But that's not to say we can't increase trust and we can't increase confidence building between states that what they're doing with their increasing capacities on the biological side. And it makes it more important to focus on things like the annual confidence building measures that are submitted. These are the information sheets or documents outlining, well, these are the labs we have, these are the projects we have, these are the kinds of experiments that we're doing. These are being shared between states and also sometimes with public members of the public, or being shared more publicly. It's also important to build connections between scientists in different countries and biodefense programs. It's important to exercise together, all these kinds of things that in the end also build confidence and build trust. And I've been involved in a number of these kinds of exercises and exchanges, and hugely important. And actually, I mean, this will be anathema to those of you in the nuclear field, but I almost think it's in the biological field, it's more worthwhile to build on these more informal exchanges of information between experts and scientists than it is to have formal inspectors going in and looking at facilities. Because when we're talking about dual use research, it doesn't help to see just what facilities they have. You need to know what kind of experiments are being carried out, what kind of expertise do the scientists have, what kind of safety culture do they have in these facilities, and that you only build up over time through these personal connections. So that's my take on bioverification in a nutshell. Nikita, why does Beijing not want a full investigation? Well, I think you put your finger on it, really. They don't want an international community to come in and tell China what it's doing wrong. That goes completely against the Beijing narrative of, we have very successfully responded to the pandemic, and actually the origin might not have anything to do with us. It might be other countries that were, where this originated. It was our healthcare system that was the first to pick it up. So it goes against this kind of the lack of control of the narrative. I think that's my opinion. I don't know. I mean, your guess could be as good as mine on this one. But yeah, it's very clear, though, that under no circumstances will China let a full investigation go ahead. And I should say, I'm not sure any other country would either. Had it happened in the UK, I don't know if the UK government would have said, come on in, we'll show you everything we got. It would have also been some sort of joint investigation. So yeah.
Thank you, Filippa. Unfortunately, we only have 4 minutes left. So I would, if you agree, I would take just 2 questions for now and see if we have any minutes left after. So Sonia and then Julia.
Thank you for your interesting discussion. I have one question regarding artificial intelligence and biological weapons. So mostly states are using artificial intelligence in military technology. So what do you say about the use of artificial intelligence in biological weapons?
And Julia, you want to go ahead?
Yes, I did have a question concerning the battle of narratives that we were discussing. I must say thank you again for the presentation. The initial outlook, chronological outlook on the stages of the pandemic has almost made me cry. I just wanted to ask, since you have mentioned how important it is to pinpoint the exact origin of the pandemic, and given that Beijing is very unlikely to comply, how can we move forward? How can we make sure that this is not happening again? And building on that, considering that the WHO has suffered a bit of a blow from the managing of the pandemic, while Beijing has tried to position itself as a great responsible power, and it's very unlikely to take any sort of responsibility, as we have mentioned. How do we move forward looking ahead for new possibilities of pandemic, considering that this has proven to be a bit of a sad exercise? How can we make sure that there is compliance should this happen again? Thank you.
Okay, I'll take that last question first. How can we move forward? Well, I think it's tied into much larger questions of geopolitics, right? There has been a pandemic treaty put forward by a number of countries to the WHO, and I expect we'll hear more about that at the World Health Assembly in May. China is a rising power, and we're going to see more of Beijing's values pushed in the international community. So this is something we're going to be dealing with, I think, not just in the biosecurity arena, but across disarmament and across international engagement more generally, where we have to take a stance on which values we will root for and which ones we will let slide, in our economic relationships with China and all of it. So I think it's a very difficult question. It doesn't have a single answer. and much will depend on the geopolitics of it. And I'm not sure we're going, you know, I'm sure this isn't going to be the last pandemic, and I'm not sure we, you know, we would hope we are better prepared for the next one, but if history is anything to go by, I'm not sure we will be. So yeah, not very hopeful, optimistic response on that, I'm afraid. On AI and bioweapons. So AI is one aspect, which I know has been really important in other regimes. And the bio regime, I think it's really more about machine learning and robotics, automation, where we're able to get more and more of this biological data. We are able to look at big bio data sets, for instance, about genes and harmful genes, and use machine learning to figure out which ones are the most harmful ones. So we'll get to the more harmful parts of pathogens much quicker. So we could much more quickly design dangerous biological weapons in the way they were traditionally conceived. So pathogens that make us sick. But I think, and this is kind of what I mentioned briefly also in the talk, that because we're now able to use biological data as part of our surveillance, and we saw that in Wuhan, for instance, where you had, you know, police monitoring people through their virtual reality goggles, where they would take their temperatures, they would check, get biological data, connect that to police databases, all in real time, where you would have these passes that you'd have to swipe in and swipe out of buildings, depending on your biological systems. Also in this part of the world, you know, we've got CCTV cameras that read how we walk and can pinpoint which individual that is, just depending on how you walk. We're not just looking at retina scans or fingerprints anymore. We're looking at how you walk. We have cameras that can read our emotions. So this kind of frightening possibility of surveillance of not just our outside, but our inside, what's inside us, our very basic. I think that is hugely frightening. And I think that is much more realistic than biological weapons that target individuals going forward. So, so that's kind of where I see some of the concerns around AI and bio kind of colliding. In fact, I should just mention this if anyone's interested. I'm working on a with the IEEE, the World Standards Organization, and we've got one of these work streams looking specifically at the interactions or the convergence between AI and the life sciences. So more information about that on my website if you want to look, if you're interested in looking at that. But our take on it is we've got to get to the industry on this and set some standards. You know, pharma industry particularly, because they're the ones whose vaccines can be tailored to this, that, and the other, and whose, you know, access to medical records and all of this needs proper oversight. Yeah, I'm sorry, Federica, I keep going on. They're really good questions, and there's lots to say on all of them.
No, Filippa, please don't apologize. And it's been such an interesting, scary at times session. I'm sure not even an entire day would have been enough. And I apologize to those participants whose questions were not, we weren't able to take, but unfortunately we have a time constraint. But before I give the floor to Mara for our next session, I would ask all our participants to please join me in giving a round of applause to Filippa for her presentation. And thank you so much again for your time and availability. We really appreciate it. And Mara, now the floor is yours.